Let's talk about Vin Jaune or yellow wine and how it's similar to or different from sherry, fortified wine from Spain.
It's quite different, even though they're both biologically aged wines with an oxidative character. Vin Jaune usually ferments in tank, and they put it into barrel. We normally talk about the ideal cellar as being a constant temperature. Oh no, not for Vin Jaune. You need temperature differences. The barrels will be there with the window open. In the winter, the temperature may go down below zero. And in summer, they will go up to plus 30. In addition, the barrels are not filled to the top. A natural yeast known as the veil, or the voile in French, forms on top and protects it from the worst of oxidation and gives its taste to it.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 281. What makes Vin Jaune from France's Jura region so special? What can you discover about the diversity of wine coming out of Jura and the French Alps? And what are some insider tips for planning a vacation or trip to the French Alps? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in part 2 of our chat with Wink Lorch. You don't need to have listened to part 1 from last week first, but if you missed it, I hope you'll go back to it after you finish this one. One of you is going to win a copy of her terrific book about the wines of Jura and the French Alps. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know that you'd like to win a copy. I'll choose one person randomly from those who contact me. In personal news, one podcast listener emailed me recently to say I have a soothing NPR voice, referring to National Public Radio, the US version of CBC or the UK's BBC. I appreciate the compliment, though I tend to listen to podcasts with soothing voices to fall asleep at night. So perhaps every 10 to 15 minutes, I should say something alarming in a big voice to keep you awake. Just kidding. I wouldn't do that, as I'd be very cross with my nighttime podcasters for doing the same. Well, speaking of soothing, at least by the end, have you read Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much? If yes, well, have you bought a copy for a friend or a family member? Please do that if you'd like to support this podcast that I do for you on a volunteer basis in very soothing tones to ensure that it continues. You can order it for yourself or someone else from any online book retailer now, no matter where you live. It usually arrives in a day or two, and of course, the ebook is instant. It's a fast read, and every little bit helps spread the message in this book of hope, justice, and resilience. You can send a copy directly to a friend or family member via an online retailer and make their day when a gift arrives in the mail rather than another bill. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/281. If you've read the book or are reading it, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Okay, on with the show. Let's talk about Vin Jaune or yellow wine and how it's similar to or different from sherry, traditional fortified wine from Spain.
Well, it's quite different, even though it's right to draw the comparison, Natalie. It really is, because they're both what's known as biologically aged wines, but with an oxidative character as well, which is all very confusing. But they are extremely different. So I will talk about Vin Jaune first and attempt to explain it. Vin Jaune The word jaune means yellow, hence the cover of my book. This is a festival of Jura wine, and I tend not to use the term yellow wine because honestly the wine never looks yellow in the glass, and it sounds more romantic to stick to the French and just say vin jaune, but to translate the jaune as yellow, of course. So vin jaune is made from exclusively one of the Jura grapes, which is called Savagnin. Savagnin is a late ripener, and they start off picking it when it's very healthy, very ripe, and only the very best, of course. And they begin by making a white wine just like any other white wine. So goes through fermentation. And then in the springtime, they put it into barrel. It doesn't usually ferment in barrel in this particular case. It usually ferments in tank. And they put it into barrel. And what is important is that the barrels are always old. And when I say old, and these are small barrels like barriques or Burgundy barrels of 2 to 8 litres, 400 odd gallons. So, no, that's wrong. I can't remember what they are in gallons, but standard barrel sizes. And these barrels are in a cave, a cellar, a vin jaune, a specific vin jaune cellar. Now, Jura breaks all the rules into so many things. That's why I was so bemused the first time I went there and tried to learn about it. And a vin jaune cellar for the barrels is noted for having temperature differences. And we normally talk about the ideal cellar as being a constant temperature. Oh no, not for vin jaune. You need temperature differences. And in some parts, it depends on the village you're in and the village traditions as to how big those temperature differences are. But if you're in Arbois, because the windows will be open in these cellars, and the cellars will sometimes be attics, so lofts, so the barrels will be there with the window open, and that means that in the winter the temperature may go down below zero to, in centigrade, -5, and in summer they will go up to +30 centigrade. So a massive difference. In addition, the barrels are not filled to the top. So a natural yeast layer, known as the veil or the voile in French, forms on top of the wine surface and protects it from the worst of oxidation and gives its own taste to it. And during those changing temperatures during the year, it becomes either fully forming across the surface of the wine, or it just sort of breaks up a bit and there are a few holes, and then it comes together again. And it's a living thing and it moves in. It sounds a bit revolting, but these are yeast, but it moves in the wine. It's all very, very mysterious.
And do the types of yeast change over time?
Probably not, no, but it's a mixture of yeast. And I'll talk about sherry in a minute, although I'm not an expert in it, but I know at least more than the fundamentals. So the other key to the making of vin jaune, and there are quite a few oxidative Savagnin from the Jura that are made in this way, but don't stay the course. To be labelled vin jaune, the wine has to have stayed for over 5 years in the barrel without ever being moved, no racking, no touching except to test it to make sure that things are going along the way. And it's not allowed to be released until 6 years and 3 months after the harvest. So just now, January, February 2024, they are beginning to release the 2017s. So right now, you won't be able to buy any vin jaune that is younger than 2017. If you see it, it's a fake. Whereas sherry, everything is different. But the comparison is specifically with Fino sherry, which what they have in common is that the Fino sherry is also aged under that layer of yeast, of floor yeast, as it's known there. I believe the actual biology of the yeast, the nature of them is somewhat different. But what is also different is that because they're using a Palomino grape grown in southern Spain, in Andalusia, the acidity is not nearly so high as with the Savagnin grape grown in Jura. The other difference is that Vin Jaune and the oxidative Savagnins of Jura are never fortified, whereas in sherry, there's always a level of fortification. And I think if we go into any more detail, we'll lose all the audience, Natalie.
Yes. Or they'll need a drink of Vin Jaune, tout sweet. So tell us what Vin Jaune tastes like.
Oh, well, it's a real shock to the palate the first time you have it. It's exceedingly dry, a big whack of acidity. When you smell it, if you're not expecting it, you might think it was off. There should not be a rancid smell, but if you've never tried it before, you might immediately go, oh, there's something wrong with this. Maderization or something like that, but that come back again, smell it again. And you might notice walnuts. You might just start to notice the smell of certain spices that you might be familiar with made in curries like fenugreek, ginger, that sort of thing. When you taste it, that real shock of acidity, and there's nothing smooth about it. It's the opposite of smooth, but there's a huge amount of complexity in it. And for a beginner Vin Jaune drinker, I would suggest having a piece of Comté cheese. So Comté cheese is the most famous or even infamous cheese of the Jura specifically.
Why is it infamous?
Well, it's infamous because it's actually the most produced cheese in the whole of France. So therefore, in the supermarkets, you will find a very ordinary quality of Comté, a little bit like, well, certainly in England, if you take cheddar, you can find very, very ordinary cheddar, and you can find incredibly tasty farmhouse cheddar. Well, it's just the same with Comté. So Comté is a very famous cheese, and when it's good, it's very, very good indeed.
And what does it taste like?
Well, if you're familiar with Gruyere, it's that type of cheese. I'm no good at giving descriptors for cheese, but it's a hard cheese. It depends on the age of it and the style and so on. But the two together are an incredible complement, especially if you have some walnuts as well. You then just go back and retaste the Vin Jaune, and it tastes amazing. And once you've got to know it, it also can be drunk through a meal with rich, creamy sauces. There are famous dishes made with Vin Jaune, chicken dishes and trout dishes and so on. And for more adventurous chefs and drinkers, it works very well with spiced, broadly speaking, Asian dishes. That's a terribly broad term, I know, but there are lots of experiments done by chefs in the Jura region and by chefs now all over the world. Jura wines are much loved in Japan. It's one of their most important export markets as well. And I've never been there, but apparently the top chefs there are constantly experimenting with matches with Vin Jaune and with the oxidative Savagnins.
Yeah, and you've had some lovely descriptors in addition to what you've shared with us. I was just picking up from some of your notes: lemony, crystallized fruit, warmly nutty, and it's acid driven. And what I was intrigued, though, as well, correct me if this is not correct, the yeast breaks down through autolysis, or the final phase of self-destruction during fermentation, when it releases enzymes that give the wine kind of an umami or that savory deliciousness factor as well.
Yeah, well, it's a very technical process. I mean, I don't really have anything more to add because it requires a scientist to.
No, those are good descriptors, though, early on.
Yeah, you need the glass in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do we serve it? Is it chilled? Is it a white wine glass?
Absolutely serve it in a white wine glass, yes. Some people do serve it in smaller glasses, especially if it's a Vin Jaune or a Chateau Chalon, which is one of the specific appellations exclusively for Vin Jaune, simply because it's very expensive and you serve small amounts. But ideally, you should have a decent size wine glass. And most importantly, do not serve it chilled.
Okay, good to know.
Serve it at, I hate the term room temperature because it's always too warm. Obviously, you don't want to have it warm, but serve it at, for argument's sake, cellar temperature. And I don't mean the Jura Vin Jaune cellars. I mean 13 to 15 to even 16 degrees. Definitely not out of the chiller or out of the fridge. You can ideally open it the day before and just put the cork back in just to keep the dust out. And you will find that it lasts, if you don't drink it all, for weeks without any problem, as long as you store it somewhere reasonably cool, obviously for storage, just when it's open. And it's a very, very long-lived wine. The other thing to say is that it's in, I very rarely use the word for anything, but it is in a unique bottle, both shape and size. I'm sorry, I don't have one in front of me, but Vin Jaune is in a Clavelin bottle, and a Clavelin bottle is the only non-standard size bottle that the EU allows, for example, and it is 62 centilitres, and you are not allowed to sell Vin Jaune in Europe in any other size. In the US, you sometimes see it in standard half-size bottles in 37.5 cl.
Yeah, it seems to have a long neck and then it curves out quite a bit.
It's sort of dumpy. It's a very squat is a better word. It's a very traditional old bottle.
Yeah.
But it, again, tiny, tiny quantity. It's only 5% of the production of the whole of Jura.
Wow. Holy smokes. Okay. So you have a wine with you that you wanted to share. Maybe we could see the bottle first, please.
Well, I picked something that was a bit of fun. It's afternoon here while I'm speaking to you in London.
Sure.
And this is actually from the little region of Bugey. And Bugey is next to Savoie. And it's actually in between Jura and Savoie. So come south down the Jura mountains and keep going south. And we're west of Geneva here. And you hit Bugey. And the first area of Bugey that you hit is called the Cerdon. And Cerdon is the name of a little town, a little village. And in the Cerdon area, they are famous for making, you're not going to be able to see the bubbles here because there's only a few of them, but they're famous for making a pink, sparkling bubbly called simply Bugey Cerdon. And unexpectedly, it's made mainly from the Gamay variety. You can also use a second variety, which is called Pulsar, which is a Jura variety. This particular example is 100% Gamay. And you go, well, why Gamay? But where we're thinking of geographically, only 50 miles or 80 kilometers to the west as the crow flies is Beaujolais, northern Beaujolais. Because I talked about Lyon before not being too far away, and Lyon is south of Beaujolais. So, other curiosity about this wine is that it's made in the méthode ancestrale. So, not the champagne method, but the méthode ancestrale, which is a single fermentation in the bottle. And so, if you've heard of pet nats are made in a similar way to this. So,
pétillant naturel, they're lightly fizzy. They're trapping the CO2 in the bottle rather than letting it release during fermentation to create a still wine.
Correct, doing that. And the big thing is that they don't filter out the yeast in pet nat. Well, in this one, they do filter out the yeast and transfer it into another bottle. So it starts off in the champagne or traditional method and as a transfer. But the most important thing is that they never add any extra yeast and sugar, which is what you do to make a champagne or a traditional method. So Sugar is in here is completely natural, and the yeast are the original yeast. And it ends up being very low alcohol and slightly sweet.
Huh. Oh, great. And it looks like a rosé. Yeah.
It is a rosé. All Bugey Cerdon is rosé from Gamay, or a little bit of Pulsar. And it's only 8% alcohol.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And it's a wine to have with fresh strawberries, or just on its own when you fancy a drink at tea time. I could happily just sort of keep supping this afternoon, and after we've finished, do a bit more work, and that'll be it.
And so you should. And what local dishes might pair well either with that wine or go back to Vin Jaune? I just wanted to talk a little bit more about food, the local dishes beyond the cheeses, which sound marvelous. Are there any others that you want to highlight?
Well, in Vin Jaune, I sort of alluded to the creamy sauces. So the most traditional dish of all is poulet au vin jaune. Or if you want to give it a fuller name and to have more expensive ingredients, then it would be poulet de Bresse. So a Bresse chicken, which is the Bresse is the region that's in between Jura and Burgundy in the plain there. And they have a famous...
Do they have the blue feet?
I think they are they blue or red? Or are they red feet? I think they're red feet. I can't remember, but they're tiny. They have white feathers and they're tiny. And the price of buying one is horrifying. They have a highway or motorway service station. It's hilarious because as you're driving down, you see it because there's this huge metal chicken, and you stop there for a coffee or something, and in their shop, they actually sell these chickens at a vast price. But they're obviously very carefully reared, lots of strict rules and all the rest. And they have a look.
How much would one chicken cost? I'm just curious.
Oh, don't ask me, but about...
You've never bought one?
No, but 4 times as much as a normal free-range decent chicken, and smaller as well. But poulet de Bresse, or just poulet au vin jaune, sometimes with morille, avec morille. Morille are morel mushrooms. You familiar with morel mushrooms? And they're very black, and they don't look anything like a normal sort of champignon de Paris, and they tend to be from the spring rather than the autumn. And they're very, very, very tasty. I think in English we call them morel, M-O-R-E-L, and in French it's morille, M-O-R-I-L-L-E-S. So they're very flavoursome. So the dish is not a long-cooked chicken dish. It tends to be in pieces, although there are a million different grandmother's recipes for this, and it's cooked ideally in a Sauvignon white wine. You honestly don't have to cook it in Vin Jaune. So you cook it in a Sauvignon white wine, and then you finish it off with the mushrooms if you have them, and with a glass of Vin Jaune towards the end. That gives it the flavour. And you can do the same sauce with trout. And in fact, they also do a pastry dish with the mushrooms and the same sauce as well, like a massive vol au vent. So those are very traditional dishes of the Jura with Vin Jaune. But the whole of Jura and the Alps as well have in common the fact that apart from that, the essential ingredients are simple peasant food of pork dishes, so all sorts of sausages, hams, saucissons, whatever, that go beautifully, charcuterie that goes beautifully with these light acid-driven, earthy red wines, and then cheeses of all sorts, either as cold cheese plate or cooked into all sorts of different dishes. So various versions of fondue, raclette, and then tartiflette in Reblochon area.
What is tartiflette?
Tartiflette is made from the cheese Reblochon. It's yet another version of potatoes that I didn't mention, which once the potato was brought to France is a staple there. So it's baked potatoes, onions, lardons or pancetta, if you prefer, little bacon bits, topped with melted cheese in the oven. And goes beautifully with the acid-driven white wines from Savoie, for example, from the Jacquard grape, or even from the Altesse variety. That goes beautifully well. Then in Savoie, you do have big lakes. So there are lake fish as well, and there are rivers with trout. And that goes for Jura as well. You see trout quite a bit. But it's relatively simple fare, unless obviously you're in some of the better restaurants where they're experimenting with international flavors, especially spices.
Oh, that sounds marvelous. It sounds like a wonderful region to visit the vineyards, the restaurants, of course, if you love skiing. What are a couple other tips you would give to those who want to travel either to the French Alps or Jura?
In the French Alps in particular, the town of Annecy I mentioned is absolutely stunning, but do try to avoid the very busy time. Of the busiest time in France is between mid-July and mid-August. And it's really, really full on. And you really don't want to be visiting Annecy at that point. But if you go in summer, get up into the mountains and go hiking. And if you can, go in June and look for the wildflowers in the meadows and up in the woods. They're stunning as well. Back in Jura, there are some extraordinary little villages. One thing I want to emphasize, as this is a wine show, is that there's more and more difficult to visit the producers, especially the trendy names. You won't get an appointment. It's simple. I can't get an appointment half the time, and I write about it. Even the importers, who some of them for my new book, I'm saying, well, can you tell me how I can get hold of so-and-so who's a newer producer that I want to write about? And they said, we can't get hold of him. We sell the wine. They won't reply because they can sell all they have and they're busy in the vineyards. They don't have staff to look after you. Having said that, you will always find some cellars open to visit, except on a Sunday where you might not. So be open-minded about it. And in Jura, there are more and more very interesting wine stores and wine bars, and you can try the wines there. And if you are familiar with Jura wines already and familiar with the prices, you'll be shocked at how much cheaper they are if you actually drink them in the restaurants in the region that have been building up their stocks of them. So enjoy that and don't worry so much about visiting the wine producers. In Savoie, it's a little bit easier to visit the wine producers, but apart from certain very trendy ones.
Great. I know time is flying, but I do want to mention your amazing Kickstarter campaigns. I'm just going to give a little background so that people who are not familiar with Kickstarter, but you had a lot of creativity and forward thinking in organizing now several Kickstarter campaigns to fund your books. And Kickstarter, of course, is a funding platform for creative projects, including films, games, music, art, technology, and more, of course, books. And supporters pledge various amounts of money to help the creator reach their funding goals to do the projects. The kicker, of course, is that if you don't get enough pledges to meet or exceed your financial goal by a certain date, all of the money is returned to those who pledged and you don't get anything. So what inspired you to organize a Kickstarter? It's highly unusual, not just for publishing, but in the wine industry too.
Well, the first one I did was in 2013, so 1 year before I published my first book. The inspiration was the fact that I have worked for myself many, many years before that, since. And I had one particular project that I think you might remember that was online fairly early that was called Wine Travel Guides. And it was a project that had a lot of plaudits, a lot of respect, and lost me a huge amount of money. So that was one thing that was just like, I'm just park that there. Another thing was that I had worked myself freelance part-time in book publishing, in wine book publishing, mainly for Oz Clarke's publishers. And I'd learned a lot about books and how many they sell and how few books actually sell a large amount. And I had vowed never, ever to write a book. from my experience. So when the whole sort of Jura train started moving and that everybody wanted to know more and more about Jura, I was on social media very early, especially for a European. Because of Wine Travel Guides, which was an online project, I was on social media. I was doing Twitter, I was doing Facebook, I was part of a lovely group of people that used to attend the European Wine Bloggers Conference. And through that, I discovered this concept of crowdfunding. There was somebody who was raising money through another platform called Indiegogo for a film about Rioja, and I supported it. And I thought, this is interesting. And I very swiftly realized that, first of all, that a book on Jura was needed. Otherwise, someone else was going to write it because other people were beginning to come in, and that I knew more and that really I had to do it. I then spoke to a couple of publishers. Nobody would publish it unless it was going to be Jura and Savoie together, or Jura and the French Alps together. Jura, Savoie, Bugey is the usual three. And I thought there's so much to say about Jura, and they get so mixed up, these regions, they need separating. And I thought, I know myself well enough. I'll have too much to write and I'm too wordy. So I need to do it just on Jura. And I don't want to lose money on it. I've already lost money on a project. I don't want to do that again. So I started investigating Kickstarter and Indiegogo and so on. And I started investigating how to self-publish. And, I had quite a bit of experience and a lot of contacts. I began to realize that it was doable. And I'm somebody that tends to read the instructions on things that I buy. The first thing I do, get the packet, take the instructions out. I promise you, I did it with these new headphones. I read the instructions. And these days, things come without instructions and you have to find them online, which is very annoying. But I read the instructions for Kickstarter. But most importantly, I had a strong social media following already. I didn't just say, oh my goodness, I'm going to do a fundraising project. I need to start a Facebook account. I already was known for my knowledge on Jura. And I already had a following on Facebook and on Twitter. Instagram wasn't a thing in those days. And so I just put it together and I learnt a huge amount doing it the first time. And that's what enabled me to do it another 2 times. It doesn't entirely fund me or fund the project or anything. It's about pre-sales and it's about buzz and it's about getting people excited. And once you deliver the book, if you continue with the social media buzz, then there are all these people with you. And at one point, I had to make a very big decision that I won't go into, but I had actually committed for a publisher to publish a book, for me to write a book for them. And this is several years ago. And it coincided at a difficult personal time for me. And it coincided when I was trying to produce my second book. And I'd already signed a contract. And I thought, I don't like letting people down, but I had done a Kickstarter for my second book. My second book had 450 people, roughly, who had kicked in for that book. And I had a choice. And I thought, on the one hand, I have 450 people, and I've already banked, it was about £20,000 from these 450 people. On the other hand, I have a reputable publisher who's given me no advance. Which do I choose? It was obvious. It wasn't just about the money. It was about 450 people. And this is the thing. These are these people who are all willing you on. And with the second book, I had a lot of problems and it was late and everything. And yet they were all willing me on. They were all behind me. They were all sympathetic. So it's about that as much as it's about the money. But my goodness, running a campaign, having just done it again for the 3rd time, this time with no support, no partner, completely on my own for 30 days. It's full on. It's full on. But otherwise, you won't make it work.
So you're always emailing people and on social media trying to promote it to get people to pledge?
Yeah. And To be fair, although I got a very decent amount of money, I didn't actually get the numbers that I would have liked. And it's partly because I didn't get round. I'm so inefficient that I didn't have a good email list. And so I did the social media, yes, but because that was a bit easier to do. And I emailed various individuals, but I never did a big email blast. Except through Kickstarter. And Kickstarter, the platform, and I mean, a lot of people knock them, but for me, they've been great. And I was able to, at the click of a button, get them to send an email to everybody who supported my first two books. Now, of course, some people will have no longer had the same email or whatever, but it definitely got me pledges, and that and social media got me through it. But if you could do email as well, you do even better.
Well, they say the gold is in the list, email. Like social media actually doesn't move as much product or whatever you're trying to sell as an email does. Yeah.
And that's the one thing I just ran out of time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But you still were successful in terms of your campaign goal. So that's very impressive.
And now I have the hard work to do to write it.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. The delivery. Wink, we're going to wrap up soon. This has been fascinating. And thank you for giving us, and me especially too, a great mini education on the Jura and the French Alps wines. And we'll all have to get your books, I should say. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
I think it's mainly to embrace the diversity that both Jura and the French Alps have to offer. In the case of Jura, the diversity is in its myriad of wine styles, but also in its mass of producers, small and big. And don't only look for the trendy producers. Be brave and try some of the others. And in the case of the French Alps, the big diversity is in the grape varieties that we've not really touched on today. And they have a whole myriad of different grape varieties that you'll have never heard of. Be brave, try them. Speak to your wine store or your sommelier and say, is there an unusual grape from Savoie that you've got a wine from, and tell me a bit about it and try it.
Right. Oh, great advice. Great advice, not just for these regions, but for wine generally when approaching. I mean, the joy, the sensory pleasure is all in the diversity of.
That's why we do it, isn't it?
It is. That's why I'm no longer working on orange juice or cornflakes. So, Wink, where can we find you? Online, social media, you and your books?
You can find me on Instagram. I don't necessarily post very regularly when I'm writing, but you'll find me there. You'll find me on Facebook. I don't follow back unless I know that you're working in wine or I know you, but you can follow me there. For my books, Académie du Vin Library are selling my books now. They distribute my books, and academieduvinlibrary.com. And they have both my existing books, and they will start advanced sales in a few weeks or a couple of months. We haven't decided yet, of the new book, Jura Wine 10 Years On. So you can find my books there to buy. You just Google me. I have a very unusual name and you'll find me. But please don't barrage me with too many questions these next few months. I'm trying to write a book.
You're busy. You're kind of busy. Yes. Absolutely. We will give you your space so that you can give us the book, Wink.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Wink. This has been delightful. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned so much, and I am going to say goodbye for now. But thank you again for being with us and for sharing a small part of your knowledge about Jura and the wines of the French Alps. So good luck with the book, and thank you again.
Thanks, Natalie. That was great.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Wink. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, what makes Vin Jaune from France's Jura region so special? Well, as Wink observes, although it's biologically aged, like Fino sherry, it's quite different due to the unique winemaking processes that involve unusual steps, like aging in a cellar with varying temperatures, open windows, and it stays in a barrel without ever being moved or topped up for 6 years and 3 months after harvest. Number 2, what can you discover about the diversity of wine coming out of Jura and the French Alps? In the case of Jura, Wink says the diversity is in its myriad of wine styles, but also in its massive producers, both small and big. For the French Alps, the big diversity is in the myriad of different grape varieties that you'll never have heard of. And number 3, what are some insider tips for planning a journey to the French Alps? Wink warns that it's becoming more and more difficult to visit the wine producers. You'll always find some cellars open to visit, though. In Jura, there are interesting wine stores and wine bars where you can try the wines, and you'll be shocked at how much cheaper they are if you actually drink them in the restaurants in the region that have been building up their stocks of them for years. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Wink, links to her website and books, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. You'll also find a link to take my free online wine and food pairing class called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemaclean.com/class. And that is all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/281. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or would like to win a copy of the book on Jura wines, or if you've read my book or are in the process of reading it at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. If you missed episode 113, go back and take a listen. I chat about tasting fresh spring wines from Austria with Rudy Rabel. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Gruner Veltliner is able to deliver from an entry-level wine, but it can move up to a really full-bodied, really concentrated, but also elegant wine. You can also make an ice wine or an Trockenbeeren Auslese, a TBA. So with the Gruner Veltliner, you have the full range of all the possibilities.
So in styles, in sweetness, in weight, and so on. Now,
yes.
One descriptor I've heard is white pepper. Is that typical of Gruner Veltliner, and why would that be, if so?
It is. The peppery taste you find very often in the Gruner, but you find also a lot of other spices in the nose. Mm-hmm. But you have also yellow fruits, stone fruits, and which type of soil it grows. That makes a huge difference in style-wise.
You won't want to miss next week when I share my conversation from the Erica Diamond podcast about my struggles with mental health and alcohol. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the fascinating wines of Jura and the French Alps. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie MacLean Wine on their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a lovely wine from the French Alps. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.